Today, we're talking about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. This movie is a rated PG-13 action-adventure comedy and sci-fi with a runtime of 150 minutes. That is 2.5 hours on the nose. Right now, 80% on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics, a 67 on Metacritic.
Which I guess is a step up for Rotten Tomatoes because the last couple Marvel movies have not done very well with the critics.
Yeah, that's true. And comparatively, though, Volume 1 got a dual 92 from the critics and the audience.
Deservingly.
Yep. A 76 on Metacritic, which, as we talked about, I think is the 4th highest in the MCU. Volume 2 also has a 67 on Metacritic. So the critics are saying roughly the same quality-wise. 85% from the critics there, 87% from the audience.
Metacritic makes a lot of sense to me right now. I do think, and I wasn't as high on the second one. I'm a little higher on this one, but I could see people saying they're both very good sequels, but they're not quite at the level of the first one.
Yeah, I agree with that overall premise that the first one is clearly better than these two.
Yes.
But I think these two are roughly in the same arena. But I think I would say the second one's better than this one. But you could argue either way. But again, I am historically higher on the second Guardians movie than most people.
As history tells us, Mac is a little bit higher than most.
This movie is written by James Gunn, who, of course, has written Scooby-Doo 1 and 2, Guardians 1 and 2. He wrote Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead movie, which I'm beginning to think that's the only reason why that movie's good. He also wrote The Belko Experiment, which is very forgettable, The Suicide Squad, the Peacemaker television series, and, of course, the Guardians holiday special as well. Upcoming, he has written the Coyote vs. Acme movie that is in post-production. He will be writing the Superman Legacy movie, as well as the Creature Commandos television show, as well as a Starsky and Hutch television show, which no one at all asked for.
I'm not convinced that's real.
Again, that's just announced, so maybe it never gets made.
Yeah.
Also writing credits on this movie are Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, who are the comic book creators of the Guardians or writers of the Guardians. This movie is, of course, directed by James Gunn, who has directed in the past Super, which is a bit of a cult classic for some, Guardians 1 and 2, The Suicide Squad, the Peacemaker series, and, of course, the Guardians holiday special. Upcoming, the only thing he's committed to directing, as we know now, he's the head of DC, just the Superman Legacy movie. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
So I think a big thing with this movie is that it does have heart and it feels heartfelt. It feels like whoever created this movie, whoever wrote this movie, whoever directed this movie loves these characters and loves the world that is around them. And that, I believe, is because, and I don't know if maybe this was the original draft, but James Gunn, of course, was fired for a little while and then came back and did it. I feel like that plays into it.
For sure. And now that I'm thinking about, and this is a separate conversation anyways, but now that I'm thinking about why he's chosen to step in for Superman, it makes a lot of sense when you consider he took, a bunch of alien type characters, what's the word? Anthropomorphic
is an alien. Oh my God.
Anthropomorphic. What's the word?
You got it.
All right. For Rocket.
Let me just tell you something right now. Hey, say it confidently and we'll just move past.
He took a tree. He took all these characters and humanized them. And I think the best thing you can do for Kal-El, Superman, Clark Kent, is to humanize him. Yeah. And so I think James Gunn is the perfect person to create that Superman movie and to give Superman the best possible backstory. So I think that's why he's stepping in there. This movie, the synopsis of Guardians Volume 3, still reeling from the loss of Gamora, Peter Quill rallies his team to defend the universe and one of their own, a mission that could mean the end of the Guardians if not successful.
Or the end of the Guardians if successful.
Yes, true. Ooh, big market tease there.
Or was I just, making stuff up?
This movie stars Chris Pratt as Peter Quill, Star-Lord, Zoe Saldana as Gamora, Dave Bautista as Drax, Vin Diesel as the voice of Groot, Bradley Cooper as the voice of Rocket, Karen Gillan as Nebula, Pom Klementieff as Mantis, Sean Gunn as Kraglin, and of course the on-set Rocket, and Maria Bakalova as Cosmo the Space Dog. Those are our current crew of Guardians.
May I say the most improved? Possibly the MVP. I'm not sure, but Nebula was great in this movie.
She is great. And when we start talking about some spoilers and where this movie went, that's a good conversation to have. Because
Yes.
if you look at her in contrast to where she was in Guardians 2014.
That's the whole thing, is that so little peek behind the curtains here, and maybe you would know this if you just listened to our last episode. But we just watched the first Guardians, and it's night and day with these characters.
Absolutely. And
I
that's
was going to say characters, and then I'm like, wait a second. No, it's one character.
well, really though, no, you do have a point there. If you, and that's a big thing about this movie is the growth of all these characters juxtaposed against Rocket's background and where Rocket came from.
Where I feel like 3 of these characters had great growth through the 4 to 5 movies that they were in. And then some of them might have stayed a little stagnant, and then others might have gotten worse, but then had a nice little touch at the end.
Yep. Some other cast members here who play, big roles, small roles, and everything in between. Elizabeth Debicki as Aisha. We saw her in Guardians 2. She played a decent role in that movie and does here as well.
Yeah.
Chukwudi Iwuji as the High Evolutionary, the villain of this movie.
So I liked him maybe as the Guardians' best villain, but he did fall into the let me whisper one line and then scream the next.
Yeah, that is a classic villain trope.
Yeah.
But I think I agree with you. If you look at the 3 villains the Guardians have primarily fought in their movies, he's probably the best one. Will Poulter here as Adam Warlock.
How do you feel about him?
I think he was a good addition.
I just read this rundown, I forgot he was in the movie.
True. They don't really use him a ton, but he is brought in here for obvious reasons, I think, going forward. I thought he was good as that sort of what's the word?
Childish, fresh baby.
Yeah, but also like an anti-hero is the word I'm looking for. Like he's not quite good, he's not quite bad in this movie.
He's almost too silly though.
Yeah, but it does make sense if you think about him as like a 12-year-old mentality.
Well, just a baby. It reminded me of in Secret of the Ooze when you have Toka and Razar, and then Shredder's like, they're babies.
True.
That's my impression, by the way.
Yeah, nice one.
Sylvester
Stallone as Stakar O'Gord. Michael Rosenblum as Martin X. That's the glass diamond looking guy, and I actually didn't know his name. You might know Michael Rosenblum as Lex Luthor from Smallville. Daniela Melchior, still don't know how to say her name. She plays some pink-faced lady in this whose name I don't remember. She was the rat catcher in the Suicide Squad.
I love the rat catcher.
Yes, she's also very good.
Rat catcher 2. Ratcatcher 1 was Taika Waititi.
Right. That's a big spoiler for that movie, Goo. Come on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nico Santos is the High Evolutionary's like right-handed man here, the machine head guy. I do not recall his character's name. Linda Cardellini, Goo, here voices Lila Otter. What do you think about that?
I loved her. I thought she was great in this.
She was really, really good in that role. And then, of course, James Gunn, friend, I don't know what else you would call him other than that, because he pops up in all of James Gunn's movies. Nathan Fillion as Master Karja. He was like the head of those troopers on that little planet world thing.
Although I did not love his character, he did have a good reoccurring joke.
Yes, he did, actually. That was pretty funny.
Yes.
Goo, I want you to give me your opinion on, so Gunn and Pratt obviously have been doing press for this movie. I want you to give me your opinion on the sort of alternate timeline or alternate reality they were thinking about, and then what it actually meant here. Gunn said that in Volume 2, Gamora almost died, and that was in large part because Zoe only wanted to play the character for so many years.
Yeah.
So originally, in Gunn's first script, he had Gamora making that sacrifice at the end over Yondu, and then Peter would learn about himself through that.
I would have loved that.
But
wow,
he said because of the natural story and where it went,
it
just made more sense for Yondu to make that sacrifice and the themes they were playing with in the second movie. And also, I think because of what happens in this movie, Goo, and the stories and the emotions they were playing with, an alive Gamora makes more sense than a dead one. You could still play with some of the themes, but I think having her in play was better. And additionally to that, the Russos wanted to have that Gamora moment in Infinity War.
Of course, yes.
So they called him, asked him how they would work with that storyline. So that was also a reason why Gamora didn't die in Volume 2. And then Pratt went on to say what that does for Volume 3. not having Gamora die in Volume 2, but Infinity War, it's pretty profound because now you have Peter sort of, going through this existential crisis, I guess, for lack of a better term. And you wouldn't be able to do that without that sort of subchapter or Guardians 2.5 that you have in Infinity War. And it really advances the story in such a way that we can tell this story now about these two, about Peter and Gamora. And Gunn, to your point, says it's also a lot about Nebula as well. And her journey works really well with all that Gamora stuff, surrounding Infinity War. And he also goes on to talk about how those two have flipped roles now. 2014, Nebula was obtuse, she was mean, she was evil, and Gamora was more of the good one. And that script got flipped on its head in this movie.
So I think that you could have done this movie pretty similarly if Gamora was not there, if she had been killed a while ago, but you needed her for Infinity War. And I do think that it helps because Peter is trying to get over Gamora while she is there, but technically not there.
Right. And so that's why instead of doing this sort of Force Ghost type character, having her there is vital to Peter's journey in this movie. And whether you like where that finishes or not, I still don't know if I love how that plays out.
Yeah.
It's vital for her to be involved in it and not just Peter thinking about her and memories of her.
Yes, I agree. No, I could have done it with or without her here, but it definitely adds that final chapter, that conclusion for Peter.
And I think it's also important too, like having the 2014 version of Gamora, the Gamora from Endgame involved here, also adds a nice wrinkle into all of this stuff instead of the Gamora we knew and loved. Goo, now that, we have watched this movie, I have since gone back and watched Guardians, the first one, and Volume 2, and actually just finished Infinity War as well. I got to give Gunn credit for paying homage to Star Wars. I know we talk about how this is sort of a Star Wars movie, and
this is my generation Star Wars.
Yeah, it sort of takes the place of Star Wars in our eyes.
Yeah.
If you think about these three movies now, the first one has a New Hope type ending where the Nova Corps is rewarding the Guardians, the crew. Volume 2 ends with them looking out into space, Goo, a sort of what's next vibe after Yondu has died, which is a very similar shot to the end of Empire when they're looking out into a what's next thing.
But would have been way more of an Empire movie if Gamora died in 2.
I agree. I agree with that. I don't know if I would have liked it because I like Gamora so much.
But it would have been stakes. We've always said stakes.
Sure. I agree. And there we have an issue in this movie with that point as well.
I hated that part. Yeah.
And then Goo, in this movie, for me, there's major Return to the Jedi vibes. Now, that can't be unintentional that Gunn has sort of followed this same sort of Star Wars jersey. I'm sure those movies molded him as well and his love for movies. And I think that's an awesome coincidence that it's the 40-year anniversary of Return of the Jedi. A lot of theaters are playing Return of the Jedi, but the themes that Return of the Jedi plays with, the very same themes get brought up here in this movie.
Now, Mac, I will say this, is that you have a lot of characters here. You have to put shine on a bunch of different characters.
I mean, just our Guardians crew alone is up to 9 or something.
I kind of have tiering here of how much I cared about specific storylines and characters in this movie.
Okay.
And I will say right at the tippy top here, it is Peter, it is Rocket, and Nebula steps right in there where I care so much about all three of them. And I think the best comedy in this movie is Peter and Nebula.
Yeah, you might be right about that. And if you remember now, too, Nebula and Rocket are the two that have been there the whole time. They're the only two that survive Infinity War. So they're the two that have been dealing with shit for the longest. And that said, as much as I liked Rocket previously, he was sort of missing this movie and this story to round him out, to make him whole, for me to totally invest in him. Because you've definitely been higher on Rocket than me, as much as I liked him.
I love Rocket.
But he's missed this underlying story to make him whole, to round him out as a character.
Now, I cared less about these characters, but they did some cool shit on screen, and that is Groot and Gamora.
See, I disagree here with your Gamora point, because I've always been fully invested in her and her journey from, kind of shitbag to ultimately a hero, and as Thanos's daughter. I've also been super invested in the Peter and Gamora relationship, but probably because I like rom-coms and you don't care for them.
I don't like women. That's what the issue is, Mac.
100%.
Then another step down here, characters that I didn't love in this movie, and that is Mantis and Drax. Lots of swings at jokes and pretty low batting average.
Yeah, I agree with you here. And this started with my critique of the Guardians Holiday Special. It was heavy on Drax and Mantis.
Mhm.
It was a good amount of just ha-has, not really landing, crushing jokes. And it's the same story here, Goo. It's not a high batting average for those two, at least relative to their prior appearances, which is worth saying because they are still very funny characters, but not as funny as we've seen them prior. You also sort of run out of situational humor with them as they become more regular characters in this story.
And then finally, just at the bottom here, I did not care for Kraglin or Cosmo.
Oh, I disagree with you here. I was a sucker for the good dog, bad dog stuff they play with in this movie. I also think Bakalova does a great job in that voiceover work as Cosmo. How do you not like Kraglin? He's just like, he's happy to be there.
He didn't do it for me.
He's a utility guy. He'll do whatever they ask. I like Kraglin.
I wasn't asking for Desi Relaford. Mac, I don't know if you've ever heard this before. I might be the first person to ever point this out, but this trilogy, music has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, as we talked about in our Guardians review, 2014's Guardians, you could argue it's the greatest soundtrack of all time.
Yeah.
And what that made me realize, and we talked about that in this episode. The more you dive into movies and the bigger your love gets for movies and the more movies you watch, the more you start to pick up on the musical notes being married with the on-screen stuff.
Yes.
And you begin to have a true appreciation for that. James Gunn, there's a couple other guys that do it quite well too. Some more with a score over a soundtrack.
Yeah.
But James Gunn is probably the best in the business of marrying on-screen stuff with the music and the themes of the music that you hear.
So let me say that I think Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is on par with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. But I think way below 1 and slightly below the Suicide Squad.
The Suicide Squad is an interesting thing to bring up against these two as well, these two sequels. But it's also like he touched the sun with Guardians, so it's hard to expect him to replicate that. But you're right. Those three are definitely below the first Guardians.
Because I think this one is as in your face with the music as 2.
Yeah. And it's not sort of a beat you over the head with what the song's saying, but it's less obvious. It's more obvious what the song is alluding to rather than a little more of a subtle thing.
And speaking of music, let me ask you this question, Mac. Is it time for movies, for cinema, to retire the song by the Beastie Boys, No Sleep Till Brooklyn?
It's not my favorite. It's really not my favorite. I'm not even a big Beastie Boys guy in general. It is iconic though. Like when you hear that, you know shit's about to happen. Shit's getting ramped up.
Yes, but we don't
use it well in this movie. Yeah, you don't necessarily need it. I don't know why he opted for that.
There's a lot of other songs. So let me say why I think they have it in here is if someone like Peter Quill, who already has that type of music taste, picks up a Zune and hears that song, he's going to love it. I do believe that.
That's true.
But I'm just sick of that song.
Yeah, and like when that song came out, pretty unique song. No other song sounded like that song. So I get why you would use it with Peter as the backdrop.
I will also say that I love the Flaming Lips. That was an awesome cue right there.
Very good. Very good.
Also, conversation-wise, and this has been through all three of them, it's more in this one than any of the other ones because you have Nebula there and constantly arguing with Peter, with Drax, with Mantis. This feels like It's Always Sunny, where the characters are either always yelling at or over each other.
Yeah, and that happens when you have a friend group and a crew that has grown so much and spent so much time together that you're sometimes when they're not even disagreeing, they're just yelling at each other because they get annoyed with
Much like you and I. We fucking hate each other.
Exactly. That's just this whole podcast.
It's a part of the show.
But Goo, we've talked about, where everyone's journey started back in 2014. And I think it's worth running through all the times we've seen these characters and the shit that they've gone through.
Fine.
So I love the story of this movie, Goo. I don't know if I loved the movie, but I love the story.
That's a great way of putting it. Like, I love the story here. And I think this movie has the same issue that other Phase 4 or Phase 5 movies have, where you watch it once, you're like, that's a good story. I liked parts of it, but then you're not like going to rewatch it as quickly as possible.
Well, I think separate from the story, if you talk about like the set pieces and the action and the jokes, they didn't nail that as much as I love the story and the themes that they're
How
playing
much
with.
right now do you want to rewatch this movie?
So to that point, this is the first one in a while I want to go and rewatch in the theaters and pay money for the MCU. But part of that is knowing there's no Guardians 4 planned, you know? So I want to get that
Guardians.
one last party with them, you know?
Yeah.
But so diving into Rocket's past and its juxtaposition with each of the Guardians' growth since we first saw them, it's an interesting thing to look at. 2014 Guardians, you have like all these established character, you know, sort of, I guess, tropes, but they do it as well as anyone's ever done it. Then you jump to Volume 2. Peter has to kill his own father, and you're dealing with that whole thing and the death of his mother and him realizing that his father killed his mother. And then you have essentially what's his stepfather or his actual father, Yondu, sacrifices himself to save Peter. In addition to this, you get Mantis joining the squad, and Nebula becomes sort of a frenemy or that anti-hero character. She's no longer an enemy of the Guardians. You jump to the next year, Infinity War. We have to remember in this movie, in the first act or early in the second act, Peter actually pulls the trigger to kill Gamora on nowhere. But Thanos uses that reality stone and nullifies that. That's momentous. That's huge. And especially in the story of two lovers, you can't undersell how much that would mean going forward. And then, of course, in that movie, Thanos kills Gamora on Vormir, sacrifices her to get the soul stone, soul for a soul. Peter goes postal when he finds out on Titan. And at the end, we lose Peter, Groot, Mantis, and Drax to the snap, to the blip.
Yeah.
Rocket and Nebula are the only two that survived that. So that's something, and you'll see from 2014, these are the two characters that definitely make the largest growth.
Yeah.
Then we jump to Endgame 2019. 2014, Gamora gets reintroduced to the group because we've lost our current Gamora or the former Gamora, however you want to look at it. But the big thing here is she has no knowledge of prior Gamora's thoughts, memories, and all that stuff. We see them briefly in Thor: Love and Thunder, but it's again the Guardians group minus Gamora. And then obviously we jump here. We don't really need to talk about the holiday special. We jump here and
Mantis is Peter's sister.
Yes. Oh, that's true. We do find that out in the holiday special. We jump to this movie, Goo, and it's a lot of our heroes dealing with that trauma of everything that they've gone through and also trying to move forward and become better heroes, better people, for lack of a better term. And that's why I think this movie is so vital to Rocket, because to me, he's still just a fun Rocket Raccoon, and he was not fleshed out until this movie.
I mean, they've been teasing that since the first one, and I've been waiting for that backstory, and they absolutely pay that off. That is the biggest thing from this movie, but the only issue is that by paying that off, you then take Rocket from the group, and he's no longer with the crew, he's no longer with Peter, and that's one thing that I love about the first one, is him going back and forth with those other characters.
Yep, that's true. But without this movie, you would never fully understand why he's so invested in Groot.
Yeah.
And after this movie, it makes that relationship so much better, so much more heartwarming. And like, because if you think back to the first one, when Groot, quote unquote, dies, we end up with Groot 2. Rocket is distraught, you know, and you're wondering why he's so upset over the loss of a tree, for lack of a better term. And this movie gives you that and gives you the backstory as to why Rocket would care so much.
And care so much about everyone here, too.
Right, right.
Mac, let's get into the gauntlet here. Fun factor. Lots of fun settings and adventures.
Yeah, lots of space. Good back and forths throughout this movie. I do think it maybe lacks the standout moment that both of the prior two movies have.
I think it lacks some of the standout jokes, some of the standout chase scenes maybe. But yeah, it doesn't quite have that same pizzazz that the first one has.
And it is an interesting thing to think about. I think we have the best villain and the best actual story or backstory that the movie's thrown up against compared to the first two, but it lacks those standout moments, it's really hard to weigh this movie against those other two.
Satisfactor, how satisfied were you by this flick? And I was satisfied by the conclusion of every character's arc. And I teared up a couple times and might have actually lost a tear there for one.
Ooh, down the old
Shed
cheek
a
there.
tear? I shed a tear. I didn't
Okay.
lose a tear.
Well, you're not
I
getting it
found
back.
it. I found it.
You're
Don't
not getting
worry.
it back. I can't say I was satisfied with where each character ended up, but I was satisfied that they addressed the path of each character and it made sense where they ended up. Not that I was necessarily satisfied with it. Also, again, I was very satisfied to see like how we got this Rocket's backstory.
Saddest factor. No, wait a second, Goo. Didn't you just say that? No. SAD. And Rocket's story was very, very sad.
Oh, of course, yeah. It's doubly as sad and heartbreaking as anything we've ever gotten in this universe, even beyond Peter's mother, which is saying something.
Yeah.
He also doesn't really get closure on that, Goo. Yeah, maybe you could argue he does, but
he kind of does.
I don't know if he gets full closure on that. He gets more redemption than closure, I would say.
Okay.
But also, Goo, I feel like Peter's story is pretty
yes.
heartbreaking at the end of this.
Also at the beginning, too.
Yeah.
Where we're starting the story as well.
Absolutely. But I feel like what I had hoped for compared to what we got, it's heartbreaking for sure for Peter.
Borometer. And yeah, it's a little long. It's 2.5 hours. I love spending time with these characters, but the pacing's a little clunky to me.
Yeah, I didn't have the same issue. I thought it was paced well, and I wasn't bored. Never checked my phone for a 150-minute movie. That's impressive.
Aquator, is it better than 2017's Aquaman?
For sure is. Absolutely.
Halloween. Will this movie wane over time for you? And I mean, phase 4 track record. So maybe, but I don't know. I don't know with this movie.
Yeah, no, I think you have a point. What I keep looking at it as is like, first of all, like I said, it's the first one I've wanted to see again in the theaters, but for the reason being going forward, I know we're not really going to have the same Guardians crew in one way or another. So it's almost like a television finale, right? It's almost like the Office finale, which isn't my favorite episode of The Office, but I like that episode and I like rewatching that episode because it's like heartwarming. It gives the viewer some closure.
Pants Tent City. Excite Bike Mania. What got you going in this movie? And Cup of Two Tree action scenes were pretty good. One specifically kind of did it for me. And then I guess really it's just the end. You know?
Yeah, no, I think one of the issues with the movie is it does lack a true pants tent for me.
Yeah.
But I did like this sort of triple threat aspect that Adam Warlock and the Sovereign introduce, where it's not just two people button heads. There's a third alternative there. And to me, that's always entertaining. There is a good sort of like sacrificial moment in this movie as well.
Max Credit Union. Who are you giving credit to? I would say James Gunn and then Karen Gillan's Nebula.
Yeah, both fair. Obviously, the villain was very good too. Chukwudi Iwuji. Will Poulter was a good addition as Adam Warlock.
Yeah.
Maria Bakalova's voice work as Cosmo was good. But for me, the one that stands out, and this was one of the first thoughts I had afterwards too, I got to give credit to Zoe Saldana for being able to go back and recapture that 2014 Gamora after spending so much time not playing that character, playing a different character. It didn't feel like it was a completely different Gamora from 2014's. It felt like she was able to jump back to that character and play it again, even though she only played that really for half a movie. I felt like she recaptured that essence despite playing a different character for the last 9 years.
No sleep till dun dun. Hot dogs! Oh, we did it. We did it. For those of you tardy to the Mac and Goo party, we rate everything on a 40 hot dog rating system. And Mac, for me, the 4 to 5 movie arc of Peter Quill and Rocket Raccoon, this did it for me. I think it nailed it for both characters for the most part. I think this movie is a love letter to all the characters, to all of the stories, to the world that was built by James Gunn and, of course, the comic creators. Is it as complete as the first movie? No. It's not as overly silly as the second movie, which that definitely helps for me. The villain might be the best in the trilogy, but he wasn't, Mount Rushmore in the MCU. He was just good enough. And this movie is definitely compelling, but I do think that although not as overly silly as the second, it still swung and missed on a bunch of jokes that, they just kept on trying and trying over and over again with Drax and Mantis. The Kraglin and Cosmo thing didn't really do it for me. I do love Nebula in this movie. I think that she's a standout outside of those top two characters. And I really would have loved it if Rocket spent more time with the crew in this movie. I'm going 34 hot dogs. I could be argued up to 35, and I wouldn't be surprised if I'm down to 33 or 32 eventually.
Okay. No, I think that's fair.
That's a huge window, by the way. Guys, I am anywhere from 20 to 40 hot dogs.
That's a fair assessment of the movie. I can't necessarily disagree with anything you said, even though I feel differently about a couple
Mac
things.
and Goo, ... They agree.
Goo, this movie's got great heart. It's very emotional.
It is.
And it's got better heart and more emotions than the first two movies. However, even though it's funny, it's not as funny as the first two, not as fun as the first two. So that definitely hurts it while comparing. And that's more of that's what we know the Guardians for, is being fun and funny. So this does that third best out of the three.
Okay.
I do think the conclusion of the movie is very, very safe. And that bothered me a little bit. So what we always talk about,
hate condoms.
Stakes. We need some stakes. We need stuff to happen.
Yeah.
Also, on top of it being safe, it was a little bittersweet for me. I had certain hopes for the conclusion of the movie that weren't met. And I'm aware that's a me issue. If I didn't have certain hopes and expectations, it wouldn't hurt it, I guess. All in all, though, I'm really going to miss this cast of characters. It's going to be really hard for me to care as much about another group of characters as I did for this group. We did get what I would consider to be the best villain of the three movies. The High Evolutionary was absolutely better than Ronan. And I think he was definitely better than the One Note Ego as well. And, I've made this point a couple times. We shit on the Disney Star Wars stuff a lot, and rightfully so. This has filled that Star Wars void for me. And so I'll always appreciate this trio of movies. I've got it at 36 hot dogs, Goo. I was borderline 35, but my wantingness to see it bumped it up to 36. I think wanting to see it again bumped it to 36. I have it at 12th in the MCU and the number 2 movie for me in 2023 so far. And again, for some context there, the first movie's at 40, the second movie's at 37. So I have it third of the three, but it's in that same range as the second one.
So for the MCU, I don't have my exact list in front of me. I probably have it coupled up with the Ant-Man movies. They're very good movies.
So
this one,
17, 18 range.
Yeah, this one's a little bit more serious than those ones, but the heart is there. And if you're looking at post-Endgame movies, I might have this at the top. I think I do.
I have this just above No Way Home, just below Love and Thunder. I still love Love and Thunder. And
I have it right around Love and Thunder. I have it, right around No Way Home.
Yeah, it's in that range. Those three, I think, are the three best since, but they all are flawed for sure.
Yeah.
And that's been a common theme with the post-Endgame movies is they do a lot of things well and some other things really bring movies down. It is just weird to think about that this movie is clearly the best story and most emotions for the viewer, but it's just not quite the highs of the other two movies.
Oh, hi, it's Goo from the Mac and Goo Movie Club. If you like what you just saw, you can find full episodes of our program on Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, CastBox, iHeartRadio, or wherever podcasts are found. And now it's time for girls jumping on trampolines.